All right, welcome to session 4 on the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. Certainly a timely topic this year. We have 4 experts on the subject, and because that's one more presenter than usual in our sessions, everybody has agreed to stick to the 20-minute time constraint so we can get everybody in and leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. You probably read people's bios in the program. We'll start with Dave Norton, and I'll introduce each person. They'll do their presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end as time permits. So Dave Norton founded an oil and gas support company and remains a senior advisor with the Hawk Group. He and former UAA economist Scott Goldsmith have developed a thoughtful analysis that considers Alaska without a pipeline. Dave.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'm gonna step over here so I can use the button. Thank you. So, where is it?
Oh, just the space bar. It's
All right. Okay, great. Okay, so like I said, this is kind of on order of a Philip K. Dick novel, you know, Man in High Castle type situation. So this is kind of, it's Scott Goldsmith is not able to be here today, so it's just me, but he and I worked together on this. He's an economist and provided a lot of the information. He actually wrote a paper some time ago. He called it, and this is a new one for me, Gedanken, German word, Gedanken experiment, which is a thought experiment about what would you do? I guess Einstein did one of those too, right? So, so I also used as a source Steve Haycock, who passed away recently, his book Alaska Colony. Excellent book. He's a neighbor and a friend, and he autographed his book for me. I'm sorry that he's not with us anymore. So anyway, the idea here was the pipeline transported one of Alaska's resources. There's other resources, and I wanted to talk about what Alaska would be like if that resource had not been here for the last 50 years. So to start that, I kind of went down a rabbit hole, and the rabbit hole is what are the other resources and how they get to be key resources in the state. So I went back to I used the state seal as a touchstone. Now, this is a seal that was used after Russia sold land it didn't own to us. It the territory was administered as a military district. So this is a District of Alaska seal. And if you can see it, it looks similar to this current seal, which I'll show in a minute. This has got trees. It's got a guy, probably an indigenous person in a kayak. It's got another person harvesting seals. It's got a guy up there with a pickaxe, maybe doing some mining. Those little things there are supposed to be igloos, apparently, according to my research on Google. And then it's supposed to show the northern lights, which don't look like northern lights, looks like a sunrise. So anyway, that was it. It was about 1880 or so. In 1910, Alaska was governed by a civilian government. It was a territory of Alaska, and a territorial governor at the time wanted to have a better seal. And he wanted to have a seal that represented the bounty of resources that Alaska had. And so this is the seal. And so this seal was a territorial seal. In the 1955 Constitutional Convention, adopted it unchanged as the new state seal. Okay, so several things to look at here. Still got the stupid northern lights that don't look like northern lights. It's got dark, ominous clouds. I don't know what that is. It had resources. It had a little house with the smoke coming up the top, supposed to represent a smelter for mining. Oh, by the way, I was talking to the head of the miners, and she said, I was telling her about this, and said, "Hey, Dave, you know how many smelters there are in Alaska?" So I don't know. She says, "Only one." I said, "Oh yeah, where is it?" What's on the state seal? So, okay, all right. Well, anyway, so that's mining. You got a guy plowing with some wheat sheaves. That's agriculture. You got trees. That's timber. What am I missing? Fisheries. You got they moved the fish and the mammals to the side there, so they're there. One thing that's missing is the native guys. And I said, well, that's kind of, why'd they take the natives off the state seal? And I don't know, I was talking to somebody, Imanati told me that at the State Constitutional Convention, there was only one Alaska Native delegate there. And so maybe, I don't know what happened there, but they apparently, there's so much going on with the state constitution, they didn't really have focus. Like, I've got OCD, I'm an engineer, so I look at stuff like this. But there's no oil either, which could be understandable if there was oil discovered in Alaska in the early 1900s, but it was not a critical resource. And but we want to talk about the pipeline and the resource in the North Slope, but the gas fields and oil fields in the South Central Swanson River, Kenai Peninsula, those were discovered in the 50s and were considered to be a relevant resource that kind of helped perpetuate the idea that Alaska, with its bounty of resources, could stand on its own and not be a ward of the federal government if statehood was granted. That's one of the reasons. So we all know how that turned out. But anyway, this is the route. And so, okay, so if it wasn't a pipeline, what would you do? Would you leave the oil up there? Or would you try to get it out? So there's other ideas about how to get it out. One idea was to fly it out. Of course, the pipeline was held up, as you probably know, because of land freeze, because natives had their claims on land had not been resolved, and there was a cloud on the title. So the pipeline people could not get title or permits to cross the land. So if you can't cross the land, you can fly over the land. So this is an idea from Boeing. Of course, that didn't work out. Probably used more fuel to fly it than to carry it. And then everybody knows about the Manhattan Project. That was a tanker. It's not the nuclear project, but the Manhattan was a tanker that went from Prudhoe Bay east across the northern side of North America. And it was successful, but it wasn't practical. Nowadays, this is a recent photograph of a LNG tanker on the north coast of Russia. And Russia transports petroleum products from the north side of Russia all the time. They've got ice-hardened tankers, got a fleet of ice-hardened tankers. They've got 40 icebreakers to help them get it out of there. Alaska's got 2 icebreakers. United States has not considered itself to be an Arctic nation. That's one of the problems why we only have 2 icebreakers. Anyway, so it could have, icebreakers, if in an alternate universe, could have taken oil from Prudhoe Bay westward. Probably would have been a lot of difficulties, might have been some accidents, who knows, but that's an example. So here's the main point, Scott, and I wanted to tell you about. Okay, so economic activity, these 2 pie charts are to scale. You can see that without oil, the pie is half the size as the other one. And what causes this is that state oil production and revenue was about 1/3 of the pie. with oil. Federal spending, both military spending and civilian, is about a third. And the remainder is all these other things that are on the state seal plus everything else. So it's oil overwhelmingly adds to economic activity beyond tourism, fisheries, agriculture, mining, all that. And if without oil, it'd be what you can see. It'd be mainly federal spending would be the economic driver. Another way to look at this, since oil started flowing through the pipeline, it's been about, I don't know, $330 billion of value. 225, most of it has been spent on operating and capital budgets. A little bit goes to the permanent fund. Some of that throws off as a PFD. So you can make the point, it's been raining oil, or it's been raining money from oil ever since the pipeline started up, but we still struggle with how to use that money. But it's for a tiny state population wise, that is a lot and a lot of money. Okay, so this is another way to look at it. This is state revenues. You can see from the 60s and then 70s when the pipeline started, it pretty much flatlined. Over 90% of state revenues comes from oil production. And if you put the mining and the agriculture, tourism, everything else, it'd be little lines across the bottom here. I didn't put them on there, but you can kind of get a sense that what the overwhelming effect of that is. Okay, so one of the effects of no oil would be on quality of life. Like, for example, University of Alaska system, it would still be a small little college at Fairbanks, and the system, Southeast and UAA and all the satellite campuses would not exist, likely. It'd be the university education system would be starved and located right here. I'm trying not to be depressing to y'all, so kind of bear with me. It's going to be okay. Let me just look at my notes so I can come up with some more dystopian ideas for you. Yeah, there's population probably would stagnate about what it was in the 60s, like 300,000 people. There would be a kind of a net out migration of families and young people, working age adults would go someplace else, find jobs. The rural area would be probably more depopulated than it is now because there wouldn't be any support services out there. A lot of village abandonment happening. Just the whole infrastructure of the state. No airports would be pitiful. Road system, all the whole ports would all be not lacking. The only thing that would come from infrastructure would be the 90% federal funding that comes from projects like that, and 10% from Alaska would be very hard to come up with. So, and then the last, this is not me, just FYI. But the Scott says that the idea that for every oil job, there's 7 support jobs associated with it, like barbers or doctors, for other professionals like that. Okay, so consequences are dystopian, but there could be some utopian type consequences. The North Slope would remain pristine and undeveloped. That would be a positive, I guess. The negatives, kind of worsening the healthcare systems statewide. So anyway, that's about, I wanted to end with a couple of things. I wanted to give you guys a lecture on consequences. In engineering, we talk about risk assessment. And risk is a combination of a consequence and the probability of the consequence happening. So you try to plan for risk and manage it. Okay, so consequence, in this case, my example is going to be Godzilla. Everybody know Godzilla, right? Big movie star in the 60s. Well, he or she finally got the movies. He'd always would stomp, destroy Tokyo, but finally in the 70s, Marvel Comics. Everybody know Marvel Cinematic Universe. Marvel signed up Godzilla for a comic book. It was a big deal. And so the first comic book came out in 1977, and Pipeline started up in 1977. It was topical. This Pipeline was topical, and it was in the news a lot. So the comic came out, and the storyline was that Godzilla came out of the Arctic Ocean to Alaska, not to Tokyo, came out of the Arctic Ocean, came walking down the pipeline, tearing it out by its roots. And finally got to the terminal in Valdez and stomped it to smithereens. So anyway, so you can see the consequence of Godzilla getting in the pipeline is very severe and bad. But the probability for a risk assessment, the probability is low because he does not exist. So we don't have to worry about that, but that's how we look at risk. So I want to think about the future a little bit. It's a bright future. Anyway, I need to wrap this up, but I want to end with Richard Feinberg. We talked about him a minute ago. He was a gadfly for the oil industry, and he was a thorn in the side of Alaska. But one of the presidents back in the day wanted me to be his minder, so I was traveled around with him. This is him and me Richard and I on top of Thompson Pass at a dig. And this guy was the most intelligent guy I've ever met. He was very thoughtful, very precise with his questions. He had a very analytical mind. I enjoyed my time with him. And he passed away year before last. And I'm going to miss him. He was and he lived here in Fairbanks, lived in Fox, I believe. Lived in Esther, excuse me. He's a great guy. I'm going to miss him. That's it.
Thank you, Dave. So Gretchen Fauski is going to join us online from Anchorage, as I understand it. She is a director at the University's Small Business Development Center and will look at lessons from the pipeline construction. Gretchen, can you hear us?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic.
And
It looks like I'm not able to share my screen right now.
Zach's working on that
Awesome, thanks, Zach.
right now.
All right. Lots of screens open. Hang on.
While she's getting that set up, I want to add one more thing to my presentation, talking about the state seal. One idea that came up with this Institute of the North last week was that because of maybe anniversary of Alaska statehood or the Constitutional Convention or even America 250, it would be possibly a good idea to redesign the state seal. Maybe have a contest like a Benny Benson state flag type situation, where a little kid have a contest, make the seal more relevant and reflective of the culture and resources in Alaska.
Hey, Gretchen, we've got your screen.
Fantastic. I'm going to try to put it to presentation view. 1 second. right. How's everything good? Okay, I think so. I'm going to get started. All right, so hi, I'm Gretchen Kowski. I wanted to start by saying that I am thrilled to be here, even if it is by Zoom. I wrote this paper for a history class I took this summer as part of UAF's Arctic and Northern Studies master's program, which was taught by the one and only Katie Ringsmith, who we just heard from. And I quickly realized how important this conversation is, not just to my work at the Alaska Small Business Development Center, which is located at UAA, but also to so many small businesses in Alaska and our broader economy. I have two disclaimers. One, that it feels a little funny to be presenting to a room full of historians in Fairbanks. I'm an Anchorage girl, and you all probably know so much more about Fairbanks than me. But I'm excited to share my observations. And the other is that I am certainly no expert on pipelines, gas lines, or other mega projects. But I do recognize the value that projects of that scale bring to Alaska. What history tells us, though, is that with extraordinary opportunities also come challenges. So the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS, in the 1970s is one of the most striking examples of an Alaska mega project. It reshaped Fairbanks, catalyzed the growth of small businesses, and left a legacy we still live with today. By revisiting TAPS, I think we can identify lessons for future mega projects in Alaska. Before the pipeline, Fairbanks was a small community of about 1,500 people. Joan Skilbred, who probably many of you know, a local Fairbanks historian, recalls it as a sleepy town with modest infrastructure improvements, paved roads, expanded phone service, but not much more. Then almost overnight came what she called a tsunami of people. Here's a quote from Joan. By the end of 1974, Fairbanks was turning into a very different place. The nation was in a bit of recession, high inflation, people looking for opportunity, and it was big, big bucks up here. People dropped what they were doing and headed up to cash in. Former police officer J.B. Carnahan had a similar memory. Suddenly, people started coming into town. It happened kind of rapidly when it took off, because I don't think anybody really believed this monstrous project was going to impact us. I mean, maybe the politicians did, but I think the average guy was just kind of going, oh, sure, we've heard this before, because this has always been a boom or bust town. And suddenly, there it was. Some of the people flooding Fairbanks in search of boomtown times and big paychecks worked directly for the TAPS owners, but most of them worked for contractors, often small businesses that were starting up or expanding to meet project demand. Let's see if I can do my slides. Okay. Before I go too far, it's important to define small business, mega project, and understand the magnitude of TAPS itself. So the SBA, Small Business Administration, definition of small business is that small businesses have fewer than 500 employees in manufacturing sectors and less than 7.5 million in annual receipts for most non-manufacturing companies. So not actually that small. Mega projects, one second, are large-scale complex ventures that typically cost more than $1 billion US, take many years to build, involve multiple public and private stakeholders, and impact millions of people. And here we have the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, 800 miles of pipeline from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, construction costs of over $8 billion and took over 3 years to build. And at its peak, more than 28,000 people worked on it, with more than 70,000 individuals contributing. So by any definition, TAPS was and is a mega project. So mega projects like TAPS bring opportunity and challenge. Projects of this scale require massive amounts of materials, equipment, and support services, which open doors for local small businesses. So one of the joys of this project was learning about small businesses during this time, which was really made easy by the Alaska Oil and Gas Historical Society Oral Archive. If you haven't checked it out, I really recommend it. It's truly a wealth of information. I'm going to share a few small business stories that I learned from the archive and from a couple interviews, and then I'll get into more of my recommendations. So the first one is Jakovich Equipment. Mello Buzz Jakovich grew up working in his father's mine in Fairbanks, and he saw firsthand the importance of having supplies available during Alaska's short mining season. If something broke at the wrong time, a business could be forced to close. With that in mind, he purchased an equipment company operating out of Seattle, renamed it Jakovich Equipment, and quickly began selling tires and mining equipment in Alaska. When word spread about the pipeline, Jakovich anticipated that a road would need to be built first and positioned his company to supply what contractors needed most, slings for unloading heavy equipment. His company ended up supplying most of the slings used during TAP's construction. At its peak, the company had 300 grease trucks in service and also developed specialized Arctic hoses, which he created in collaboration with Goodyear to meet extreme conditions. Jakovich eventually expanded into retail construction and industrial supply stores in Fairbanks, Valdez, and Wasilla. And although he sold in 2023, the businesses are active today. Another small business was Quality Meat Company. Feeding tens of thousands of hungry workers required reliable suppliers, and the Franich family's Quality Meat Company rose to the challenge. Founded in 1940 by Joe Franich, the business was already a trusted supplier to Fairbanks restaurants and hotels when it was awarded a contract to supply some of the pipeline camps. John Franich, Joe's son, pictured here, remembers delivering fresh beef daily and coordinating logistics for thousands of pounds of frozen food each week, approximately 80,000 pounds in total. The Franiches focused on feeding crews well. Menus included porterhouse steaks twice a week and lobster tails once a week. One worker recalled it as like Mother Goose Fairyland, Disneyland, all rolled into one. It was all you can eat all the time. If you wanted breakfast, you could have a 5-course meal, and for supper, you could have even more. The Franiches eventually sold their company to Sales Associates of Alaska in 1997, and John pursued a career in law. Linden Transport is a very well-known company in Alaska. Jim Jansen, who is here in this interview, came to Alaska as a truck driver for Linden, where his father, Henry, known as Hank Jansen, was a part owner. After working for Linden in Anchorage and Juneau, he relocated to Fairbanks in 1974 to support TAP's construction, starting with a single line driver. Within a year, Linden's Alaska operation had grown to around 300 drivers, hauling freight during road pre-construction and after. Jansen described the drivers as nomads or outlaws, many fleeing the recession in the lower 48 and chasing fortunes in Alaska, a time he says was wild and woolly. Some drivers lived in their trucks, and at one point, Jansen had 27 people staying in his house with his wife doing the cooking. Very impressive to his wife. Linden anticipated that the project would end and developed 3 guiding principles: stay rooted in Alaska, focus on transportation, and maintain independence from full union control. They then focused on diversifying, creating Alaska West Express for heavy hauling, Alaska Marine Lines for barge operations, and launching air cargo with Hercules aircraft. Today, the Linden family of companies provides transportation and logistics services across Alaska, Canada, the Pacific Northwest, Hawaii, and beyond, and offers services air, land, and sea. They employ 2,600 people, with over 1,000 of those located in Alaska. And my final small business feature for today is F. Robert Bell and Associates. I had the pleasure of interviewing Bob Bell for this. So in 1974, F. Robert Bell and his partner John Herring founded Bell Herring. It began as a modest 2-person operation, just with the 2 of them. However, the timing coincided with TAP's construction, and demand for surveying and engineering expertise skyrocketed as thousands of miles of routes, pump stations, and facilities needed to be planned and built. Today, as F. Robert Bell and Associates, the company continues to operate in Alaska, an example of how pipeline-era opportunities propelled small firms into making a lasting impact on our state's economy. Taken together, these stories highlight the many different ways small businesses respond to the opportunity of TAPs. Jakovich Equipment succeeded through innovation and anticipating needs. Quality Meat Company thrived by meeting a basic human need with excellent menus. F. Robert Bell and Associates scaled rapidly by delivering technical expertise when demand exploded, and Linden Transport endured by planning ahead and diversifying beyond the boom. Each business took its own path, but the lesson is the same. Mega projects create extraordinary opportunities for those ready to act quickly, take risks, and adapt. All right, so for every story of growth and success, there are consequences. The same boom that lifted businesses strained Fairbanks' housing, infrastructure, and public services to the breaking point as workers flooded into town. Housing was in especially short supply. Families lived in tents, cars, and hastily converted trailers. Joan Skilbred recalled her family paying a fortune for what she called a rundown, dilapidated trailer, while others packed dozens of workers into houses, renting out bunk beds by the shift. Homesteaders subdivided land into trailer parks to meet demand. Infrastructure could not keep up. Building new homes stalled when utilities couldn't install power and roads fast enough. City jobs went unfilled as workers took higher paying pipeline work. Then, almost as quickly as it began, the pipeline construction ended. Thousands were suddenly unemployed, flooding back into the labor market and creating a surplus of workers for government jobs and local services. Basic goods were scarce during the TAPS construction days, but nightlife and luxury items flourished. With a workforce made up of 90 to 95% men, Fairbanks saw an explosion of bars, strip clubs, and sex work. As Spielberg put it, there were ladies downtown, legendary hookers. You couldn't walk downtown without seeing them everywhere, and they wouldn't be there if the demand wasn't. The lesson here is that mega projects make impacts far beyond the job site. They reshape entire communities, sometimes in ways that outlaws the boom itself. So lessons for today. Why should we be revisiting TAPS now? Because if you look at these headlines, Alaska is predicting a resource renaissance. Once again, looking at multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. People talk about a gas pipeline, ports, mining prospects, and more. And so when you take the lessons we learned from small businesses and community impacts of TAPS, we can ask ourselves some pretty important questions, which are up on the screen. I don't have all the answers to these questions, but I do have some lessons and potential solutions that are just a beginning, and I hope we can build on. So for workforce, a lesson from TAPS is that workers left stable jobs for high-paying pipeline work, creating shortages elsewhere, and at the same time, workers flooded from out of state flooded Fairbanks. So the state of Alaska is working on this. We all know that Alaska is facing a workforce shortage already that challenges our economy, and mega projects will magnify those strains. The state of Alaska authored Alaska's Workforce Future Plan, which is trying to align training programs with employer needs, building apprenticeships, and retraining local workers. We could also expand programs like the Fairbanks Pipeline Training Center to ensure Alaskans are first in line for jobs. But these measures likely won't meet workforce needs, which leads to the next lesson about revenue. So we saw from TAPS, non-resident workers earned wages in Alaska, but spent much of it outside of the state. I know there was a lot of in-state spending too, but a lot of it did leave. During pipeline construction, Alaska did have an income tax that captured some of that outflow. So for discussion for today, I recognize that reinstating an income tax is politically fraught, but there could be targeted temporary measures like a temporary income tax or local sales taxes in mega project communities that could keep more dollars in Alaska. Every dollar spent in Alaska supports job market growth 4 times faster than one paid to an out-of-state entity. For a geographically isolated state like Alaska, we're surrounded by ocean on 3 sides and Canada on the 4th. Once money leaves, it's not very likely to return. So the broader takeaway here is that when outside labor is unavoidable, we need to plan for how to retain economic benefit to balance the strain on public services and infrastructure. So speaking of infrastructure, public services, infrastructure, and housing are incredibly important, as we all know. During TAPS construction, Fairbanks housing market collapsed under demand. Families were left in unsafe or makeshift housing. Utilities and public services couldn't keep pace. So, and again, I know these solutions won't solve everything. This is just sort of creative thinking to get some ideas going. But we know that housing is already tight across Alaska. Addressing this requires proactive investment, accelerating affordable housing projects and addressing existing challenges with unhoused populations, potentially incentivizing modular and prefabricated construction, which is even better if it's manufactured locally, and building worker housing that doesn't directly compete with community supply. I don't know how to do this personally, but I definitely think planning around public infrastructure like schools, healthcare, and utilities should be expanded in tandem with project timelines, not when it's too late. And finally, small business support. We saw that small businesses seized opportunities and thrived. Some were more temporary, some were for decades, some we still see in business today. But it's likely that many others weren't equipped for the rapid scale up. Organizations like the Small Business Development Center, where I'm proud to work, provide training and resources to help small businesses manage, grow, and diversify, and also prepare for downturns. We would need more capacity to handle a surge in new entrepreneurs, and businesses need to know about our services so that they can use them to make sure they're protected, whether they're in a boom or bust cycle. So revisiting task construction shows how much a single project can shape a place and an economy. For Alaska's small businesses, it created incredible opportunities, some lasting decades. As we look ahead to future mega projects, let's learn from the lessons of that era to help Alaska maximize economic impacts in the future. How to support local workers and businesses, how to plan for what happens after the boom, and how to make sure the benefits stay in Alaska. I'd like to close with advice from Bob Bell to business owners, and I think some of it applies to our broader state of Alaska. It's easy to succeed when a big project is going off, even with minimal effort. But in the long run, if you're going to own a business, you've got to be willing to take risks. If you're too timid, your business will just fade away. You have to grab every opportunity, and that means taking chances. I'm not saying being crazy, but don't be afraid to go for the long shots. Whatever you do, don't go out and spend everything you make. Save some of that money. With that, thank you so much. I really wanted to quickly thank Rebecca Logan, Bob Bell, Jim Zanson, and Ryan Dixon. Of course, Katie Ringsmuth, the professor who is the person who got me to write this paper, Kendra Conroy, my coworker, and then the Oil and Gas Historical Society, the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, Anchorage Museum, and Alaska State Library, which are such a wealth of resources about this time. That does it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gretchen. And now we'll go to Dave Haugen, who has produced a book documenting his experiences on the pipeline as an engineer and project manager. Most recently, Dave was a project manager at the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation. Dave.
Which one do you? Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you folks. Let's just get right into it because we don't have a whole lot of time. And I won't bore you with the resume. You can take a look at that. Just of note, I did spend a considerable amount of time with Lyndon. So the prior speaker talked a little bit about that, but that was after the pipeline had come and gone. So that's part of my background. So everyone knows the alignment of the pipeline. That's ingrained in everybody's brains from all these talks we've had. But this is the explanation of how it was organized during the time that I was one of the project managers on the project. So from the south to the north, it was divided into 5 different sections. And then you can see on the triangle, that's the construction camps. We had roughly 20 construction camps that were scattered along the right of way. And so each of the sections had their headquarters in some locations. So section 1, for instance, had their headquarters in Glen Allen, section 2 in Delta, section 3 was headquartered here at Fairbanks at Fort Wainwright. And then section 4, it was Old Man, and section 5 and 6 was up at Galbraith Lake. So that's the way the organization was put together to control the pipeline construction, and it was headquartered here in Anchorage. We took over part of the north post of Fort Wainwright, and that's where they were, most of the hierarchy of the project management organization was located. So this is a short, and we won't bother with going through all this because this just highlights just some of the major time frames of the pipeline coming into existence, starting with the discovery of the oil itself. And we've heard from others about the Pipeline Authorization Act that passed in the Senate with just a tie vote. And then other things. We did commemorate this past year here in Fairbanks the completion of the haul road, which was critical to getting things going. And then this year, just in March, we talked about the first pipe was actually installed just 50 years ago down at Tonsina. And then we're looking forward to a big celebration coming up in 2077 with the first oil, the final weld and the first oil on the project. So some of the things to keep in mind with respect to the pipeline itself, and others have talked about this, but in fact, this morning discussion quite quite a talk about seismic criteria. That was one of the major accomplishments of the engineering effort. But the big one, of course, in the Arctic engineering side was dealing with permafrost. That generated the requirement for the above-ground system to be designed from scratch and implemented and constructed. And I think the fact that 50 years later on, in terms of operations, it has withstood the acid test of just performing well. And Greg's already talked about that. I won't belabor that process at all. But there were other examples. Lots of erosion control measures were implemented and put into place. The geotechnical issues that are common in Alaska were really something that had to be dealt with on a very fast basis. We were always uncovering unintended geotechnical conditions, primarily undetected permafrost, even though Alyeska spent a considerable amount of money before the pipeline started construction in terms of exploration, drilling. There was still lots of surprises that occurred when we actually started to dig the ditch or to actually install the VSMs. So the other thing that was highlighted by some folks this morning as well is that it was the first mega project that was completed under the NEPA rules that had just been passed just before the pipeline was authorized. And the problem that represented to those of us that were in the field activities were that it was still a work in progress. It wasn't quite certain as to what the permitting rules were all about. And because of that, there was a lot of confusion about how it was to be overseen. The federal folks, by act of Congress, did create a Office of the Federal Inspector, and Andy Rollins was the retired general. He was put in charge of that. On the state side, then Chuck Champion was put in the role of the state pipeline coordinator's office. And those were the folks that were responsible for their respective parts of the pipeline alignment. The idea was that they would control any of the other agencies under their direction. But the actual fact of the matter was there was still plenty of give and take that was going on during the construction period, and that generated no shortages of delays and permit hangups that impacted the project. So it was a unique time and the first of its kind. So quickly on my initial work on the pipeline, I was actually on the pipeline in 1970 and was part of the original surveying that was done. So I was working for a company at that time out of Anchorage called Ocean Technology, and we had the contract to survey the pipeline from the Valdez River Valdez up to the Yukon River. So that was our scope of work. So in a case like this, the first thing you'd have to do is establish the control network. And in our case, for the southern part of the project, we were fortunate along the Richardson Highway, we could use control points that had already been established years ago when the Richardson Highway was constructed. So that's how you start out to develop the control work to make sure that your alignment is going to be accurate. So here's some looks at what it looks like in the summertime when you're in the middle of some real tundra country, and mosquito protection is what is required. And believe me, well, you folks know better than anyone what mosquitoes can do for you right there. Or if it's in wintertime, then it looks like this. So again, we had at that time in 1970, the thought was that the project was going to start construction immediately. The pipe had already been bought and transported to Alaska. In 1970, as a surveyor out on the pipeline, we were told the construction is going to start like in 1971. And so get it surveyed before we can get going on it. So there was a real push to do that. And that meant surveying in some very harsh conditions. I can remember well my time in Fairbanks in the winter of 1970-71. For those of you that were here, a record snowfall and record cold weather. We were serving across Eielson Air Force Base at that time. It was getting up to 35 below in the summer, in the heat of the day and down to 45 below at night. And so it was pretty good and going. So there we go. We started out on Copper Center, working both down to Valdez and then up this way. We were flying up to these control points, which are located on the top of the mountains using the helicopters, and then getting the accuracy we needed to put it on the ground. Once you've done that, then you come back on the ground and you go from these points that have been established and actually brush the line from one point to another, and that becomes the actual alignment that the pipe is then gonna follow. And in the wintertime, to get out on the right of way, we used mechanical vehicles that we could, like snow tracks or snowshoes or whatever it took to do it. But we surveyed right through the wintertime. It was, you know, again, kind of grim going, but the pressure was there to get it located. And some of us also I ended up down in Valdez and was part of the original crew that surveyed the actual Alyeska terminal down there in 1970, 71 for locating that. So, and that's the type of helicopter we utilized back in the day. And of course, it's a lot better than having to walk in. This is me down in Valdez. As a matter of fact, this is 1970. So that tells you I've aged just a little bit since that time. Of course, at that time, the pipe there's 1/3 of the pipe located in Valdez. And here in Fairbanks, of course, the Bentley property, that's where, for those of you that are old enough to remember all that was 1/3 of the pipe there. And then the remaining pipe was stockpiled at Prudhoe Bay. And that's when the pipeline construction was able to start. So we started in 1974, and I was hired, and at that time, not being to take transitioning away from my survey days, I hired on to be a project engineer with Alyeska, the owners themselves. And so I was originally going to be down in San Francisco, where we were working at Bechtel's offices to do the original work on selecting the contractors. But then I got called off to that and came up actually to work on the haul road. And I reported up here and ended up at 5 Mile Camp in 1974 and in May and June to work on the haul road construction. So at 5 Mile, that was kind of a hub of a lot of activities going on. We had also put in place at that time, Alyeska put in hover barges so we could run across the Yukon River and get trucks over there because the bridge had not been finalized by that time. And it's interesting because in about a week from now, here in Fairbanks, there's going to be a celebration of the completion of the construction of the Yukon River Bridge. So once that occurred, of course, it made a totally different world for the construction north of the Yukon. So the 1974 timeframe was in the field where I was located all the way up to Prudhoe Bay, a really intense timeframe. And we were pushing hard on getting that haul road constructed. And we had roughly 30 million cubic yards of gravel that had to be installed in the project. And it was accomplished in 154 days. So it was unparalleled as to the speed of how that occurred. And you saw in the earlier layout the number of construction camps that are located at that time along the Yukon River up to Prudhoe Bay as well. That also had to be, some of them were in place with small fly camps, but we had to do a lot of excess camp construction because of the incoming pipeline activities. So I was up there until the completion of the haul road in the fall, and then I got transferred down to Section 2 at Delta Camp and was working on all the construction camps south of the Yukon at that time. And there's the shot of the typical. And of course, after the haul road was constructed, a lot of the crews shifted right over to do a work pad construction. So the Alyeska project is fairly unique because it has a complete work pad along where the pipeline is installed, either on above ground or below ground. And that's not normal. Normal construction of pipelines, lower 48 and other places don't have work pads like that. So this combination of the haul road at 30 million cubic yards and the work pad had another 30 million cubic yards. The grand total was 60 million cubic yards of gravel for between all that, which is a phenomenal amount of earthwork. So I went back up to section 4 for a while and was working with a pipeline, had gotten started at this time in early 74, 1975. And Bechtel had been brought on board to be the construction project managers. And underneath Bechtel were each of the section execution contractors. So Associated Green was the contractor in section 4 that reported then to Bechtel. And then a few of us were at the top of the food chain working as Alyeska people. And that was going very well, and life was looking good. But as always is the case, when it's getting too good, then you sit on your laurels and then realize that there's more things to do. Section 2 had gotten into trouble out of Delta Camp. We suffered, Section 2 went up as far as the Salcher River, and Alyeska attempted to try to get road access from the Richardson Highway into the northern, along the Salcher River, and it was held back. A lot of the local folks didn't want to have any access to that area. And so because of that, Section 2 got behind and was in difficulty. So I was sent down there to help out and get going on it. But by the end of the 75 timeframe, we were about 50% complete on the project up and down the entire pipeline. So we were getting in each of the sections like about a mile a day pipe welded up and installed in the ditches in each of the 5 sections. So that's what had to be done to keep it on schedule, because the whole objective was to get it completed and operational by June of 1977. So by the year end, we're talking about what we're going to do in the remaining year coming up. So we had a lot of issues there in Section 2 because there was about 20 miles of it south of Isabel Pass that we thought was going to be able to be buried, and then at the last moment discovered there's a lot of undetected permafrost in that area, and we had to get all the equipment brought in, all the VSM materials, all the extra hardware, and remote it from being buried pipe to elevated pipe. And that was a very last minute difficulty that we had to get it done. But as luck would have it, we did get it done and get it completed. In fact, actually at the end of the time, Section 2 ended up being the first of the sections north to south that actually got mechanical completion. So in late 76, I actually got transferred back up here to Fairbanks, and my job when in 1977 was to turn over the pipeline from the construction side of the fence to operations. So we went all the way up and down the line, and Alyeska brought in their new operations personnel. People like Greg Kinney would be turned over from the construction side, and we'd hand it over to them. There was still work to be done down at Thompson Pass. The final routing had to be done at the top of Thompson Pass, and a lot of restoration work. And the final turnover was going on just prior to 1977, June, when the pipeline was actually, the first oil was put in. So I did end up finally, after all this was said and done and the project was completed, I did spend a little bit of time with the tariff situation that people have talked about, and it was finally, TAP settlement agreement was finally dealt with and settled in the mid-1980s. I did come back after all of this in 1979 through 81. I returned to Alyeska. I was the project manager for the construction of Pump 7, and I got that one completed as well. And then my tariff work was the end of the time that I spent with Alyeska. So I'm happy to see down at Valdez, there's the memorial there, if you've been there to see that. I did get a little time to work with the actual sculpture on the guy that did the sculpturing. And my contribution was he wanted to know how to equip the people that are in the memorial as to what they would typically wear for clothing, things of that sort. So that's my minor contribution to the memorial. But I think it does a great job of really putting together the workers that were part of the project. As has been mentioned, there was 20,000 plus people spread out for the 800 miles in 20 construction camps. And it was a phenomenal effort. And I was really happy to be a proud participant in the whole thing. You really want to know more? I wrote a little book on this one, and there you go. There's my plug. So if you want it, it's on Amazon and whatever. But it tells in more detail about my history. But we won't belabor the point. So we'll talk about any questions you have later on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Now our last presenter is Greg Kenny, who many of us heard from this morning. He's also an engineer and has worked with Alyeska since 1989 after working on TAPS construction in the mid-1970s. He will discuss TAPS, past, present, and future.
So while we bring this up here, this is actually I've given this several times, and our vice president of engineering has actually given it a few times too. It takes you through construction all the way up through present day. So obviously we'll have to truncate it somewhat for this, and I've tried to do that. Painful sometimes making the cuts here, but we do want to leave time for questions and answers here. So, just getting right into it here. Let's see if we change the slides here. Yeah, I'm going to give a couple facts here about it. We'll gloss over that pretty quick, and then we'll start just going decade by decade, but only hitting like one or two items. And I'm going to be leaving out a whole lot of stuff here that, some of you may think about, but we can talk about it on questions and answers too. So you've all heard about the length of it, what we have to cross. I'm going to skip past that. I'm trying to gloss things over. And we talked about the pump station layout this morning here. So we're just down to 5 right now. That's all we operate in response bases. It didn't really say a lot about the terminal, but the terminal in Valdez is something we actually own in fee simple. And originally it had 18 500,000 barrel storage tanks. This is just a huge capacity, I think actually exceeding anything else this on the West Coast. So we had a whole bunch of other systems in there, including vapor recovery, power generation, and so forth. We haven't really reduced it by that much in terms of capacity. We're down to 14 tanks now. We took the West Tank Farm out of operation quite some years ago. We relocated OCC, the Operation Control Center, to Anchorage. But we do have some other systems in addition to what we had there, notably a back pressure system, and we had an enhanced vapor recovery system. You might remember, those of you back in the Wayback Machine there, the sort of blue haze over the terminal, that was a real deal. This vapor recovery system, actually, when that was commissioned in the 90s, that did away with that problem altogether. And I won't be talking about that elsewhere. So we'll first talk about the first decade of operation. So a little bit of a different spin than I gave this morning. First thing that had to be done, remember, TAPS was constructing, operating, and maintaining the pipeline. You got to make that transition from construction to operation and maintenance. That wasn't necessarily that easy a change in terms of just mindset. I know that when I got to Alyeska as an engineer, which was about in 1989, my supervisor had been a construction guy. And I don't think he quite ever, got out of the, sort of project mindset. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it at all. But, it's a different set of challenges in terms of, you got to proceduralize, you got to, concentrate on as-built and things like that. So we had to struggle with that for a while. We talked this morning about settlement, so I won't dwell on it again. We also talked about production ramp up. This slide just happens to go into that in a lot more detail as to some of the things that we had to do. Let's get to the second decade. It didn't really talk about that a whole lot. It didn't start out all that great, This by the way, this happened about 2 to 3 weeks after I first arrived as a contractor, supposed to be there for about 6 months or so. But, although it wasn't us that spilled the oil, we were, involved in the response. And, that whole incident and the response to it definitely influenced our readiness for, there was legislation that was passed. We ourselves did a lot of improvements to make sure that we're, on top of it for any future spill. There is also, just coincident with that, and I mentioned it this morning, the first of our inline inspection devices that came over from Japan, a company called NKK manufactured this device that picked up a lot of what we call corrosion anomalies, or PITs. Anomalies just being a word for, doesn't look right. And, so it turned out we ended up having to excavate and replace, about 8 miles of pipe. Actually, we left the pipe in place, but we ran parallel to it. So that was that Adigan reroute project I talked about this morning. Facility ramp down was our next challenge in the 90s, and I touched on this. Is that we had to have several stations go offline as we were declining in throughput. There got to be a point where we simply did not need the forward horsepower flow anymore, because what we call the head loss lines flattened out enough that you can make it to the next station down. You just eliminate pump station 2. You can get to pump 3 just fine. So pump 2 went 6, 8, and 10. Later on, pump station 12, and then pump station 7 still later. Right-of-way renewal, this is sort of beginning the next decade, I call reconfiguration and renewal, starting roughly in 2000. That was the first challenge, and the gentleman right here, Dave Norton, was actually one of the leads on that, along with, I believe, Steve Jones from BP. And got it done. As Dave mentioned this morning, it was there were many issues to resolve. I believe we got all of the stipulations of the agreement, and grant of right-of-way were carried over without any modifications, which was an accomplishment, and particularly on the seismic side, as David mentioned. So, and this was a key part of it right here. We talked about this at length this morning, as being our, quote, final exam. So strategic reconfiguration really kind of dominated that whole decade. In fact, as all of this was going, that Dave was working on, I was working on a team that was looking at how to modernize our facility, do electrification and automation, for remote monitoring and operation, with an idea that we don't need as many people in the field. Maybe we can consolidate our oil spill response bases and make this a more efficient system going forward, in light of the fact that we were declining in throughput. So we did, in fact, modernize a number of these facilities, pumps 9 at first, pump station 3 and 4, and then finally pump station 1, and did communications and controls improvements elsewhere. So this was a multi-year, actually kind of a mega project in its own right. Biggest thing we've done. So our throughput history, we talked about this this morning. We're starting to, kind of tail out, getting to the 500,000, now 480,000 barrel per day. There's days that we're, significantly less than that right now. We try to maintain a very, very high reliability, and we're successful at that. There's very few challenges in terms of maintaining 100% even reliability. So we're up to 19 billion barrels now that we've shipped. That just happened, I think, this last month. It was, quite a milestone. But we do have a challenge that just, as we talked about, keeping forward flow. It's not so much keeping forward flow, but we have temperature issues that end up being caused in the winter, just because of the residence times. And at one point, it was less than 4 days from Prudhoe Bay down to Valdez, or 4.5 days. Now it's about more like 18 and a half days, which is pretty significant, when it's 45 or 50 below. So what do we do? Or actually, why is it even an issue? What we're most concerned, we were concerned about a number of issues, gel strength, wax formation, and so forth. But mainly right now, I think we got it down to really it's the water content, which although it's very fractional, we try to control it at less than 0.3%. And this is really the owners. We work with them on that. But even with that, there is the possibility of some water dropping out or, accumulating at some low points. We do a lot of things to mitigate that, like cleaning pegs that we run every couple of weeks to every month. But it can still plate out on instruments and, cause some problems. So therefore, we have to manage the temperature in the winter to what we call target operating temperatures. And, you can see kind of how the temperature line, this is a temperature versus milepost graphic. And, for 500,000 barrels a day, which we actually run a little bit less. And, so typical weather, we might run into that. Those little bump ups, by the way, are where we add heat, either through recirculation of, crude oil, which we do at pump station 3 and 4 under some circumstances, or through a heating operation that we may have. So that dotted line over there, the dash line, that represents 32 degrees. We don't want to go there. So what we've done is, we built some what we call point source heating sites. One of the RGBs or remote gate valves north of pump station 7, so about, 90 miles north of Fairbanks or so, near Livengood. We've since moved that up to pump station 6, or what we now call the Yukon Response Base, which is right along the Yukon River. We have another one at pump station 8, south of Fairbanks, and then also at milepost 238, which happens to be Coldfoot. So looking forward, that takes you more or less up to today. Moving forward, we actually have an opportunity to increase throughput, increase flow in the pipeline through the current projects that are going on, Willow, Pika. So, this will be great. First time in my career that I've seen kind of like an upside here. It's been, steadily declining ever since I got there. I don't think I'm the cause. Warming climate, we talked about that this morning. That is a challenge. This happens to be a photo showing the frozen debris lobe, so-called, which is up north of Wiseman, or about pretty close to Wiseman. We're working with our partners over at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, notably Margaret Darrow, on that. They have, what you see there is the realignment of the highway that has happened, and it's migrating toward the highway. It's actually chewed up the old road now, by the way. And the pipeline is downstream of that. So, okay, it's word to the wise, be on the lookout. Finally, we're going to be looking at right-of-way renewal coming up in 2024, I believe, or 2034. So that'll be the next 30 years, so 60 years in. So that's what I've got.
All right, thanks to everybody for great presentations and staying under the time limit. We got about 12 minutes or so for questions. Anybody back there?
Yes, thank you for the presentations. I'm wondering about the elevated sections of pipeline and how innovative those legs that support the pipeline were at the time. Was this a new invention, or was it an imitation of other? And then does Russia or another oil producing country imitate that technology?
So I'll just make a comment, and I know that Dave and Dave would have comments on it too. That was very innovative at the time. And as a matter of fact, this is going to figure largely into the nomination that I personally am going to be putting together for the 50-year anniversary of TAPS to get it nominated for a National Civil Engineering Landmark, the American Society of Civil Engineers, because it was innovative. There's actually a patent on the support system that's a couple of different patents, one for the bent and support system that's held, I think it was Jim Maple was involved in it, Spence Hochstein, but it's under, you know, it's out there. As far as I know, now, the Russians did not imitate that. And by the way, the Russians were way ahead of the Americans, you know, in the 50s and in the 60s. They knew more about, you know, permafrost, geosciences, far more than we did. And as a matter of, you know, people like Hal Payton here at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks studied what they had to offer. And unfortunately, the Russians themselves didn't necessarily apply a lot of their lessons because their pipeline, their Trans-Siberian pipeline a few years later, although it employed like automated welding and everything, they were pretty much just laying it on the ground, as I recall. And they had big problems. They started coming to us talking about, oh, what's your guys' loss rate? What do you mean by that? How much oil do you lose on the way down? 0? Yeah, that wasn't the case for them.
Yeah, just to follow through on your question, it was a very innovative design and a very difficult thing to engineer. And it had, I forget how many simultaneous equations to solve on each of the bent structures. In fact, Alyeska had to actually go to Boeing to get the computer power requirement at that time so they could actually do it. The reason for that is you have a combination of seismic loading you have to take into consideration. The pipe's allowed to swing back and forth in a seismic event on the elevated part of it. And you also have to be careful of the temperature of the oil going through the pipeline and the ambient air temperatures. And you have to take all those things into account when you're putting the pipe in place during the construction period. I can speak a little bit to Russia. I've traveled a little bit in Russia, and what Greg says is absolutely correct. A lot of the Russian pipelines were built on top of just timbers instead of elevated structures. They also had another philosophy, which I didn't understand. In river crossings in Russia, it's common practice to put in 2 or 3 pipes. And I asked the Russians, why do you do that? He said, well, that's because the first one's going to fail. We got another one to go to after the failure of the first one. Well, you know what happens when it fails? They weren't good on spill response, shall I say. So,
Thank you.
You want?
Oh, I just echo what everybody says, except I want to reinforce what Greg said about the contribution of Hal Payton, who was on the faculty here. He was a key element in the design, not only of the above ground system, but anything related to permafrost geotechnical design. He passed away right about the time the pipeline started up, and it was very unfortunate he didn't get to see the fruit of his labor.
Other questions? Let's try to get you on mic for the listening audience.
I just have a comment on since you asked the question about the VSMs, we haven't talked about the equipment to install it. And Dave, you might remember the Raymond drill in section 4. It was ginormous and it had 130 miles of hydraulic lines. So that just gives you some of the scale. And one track frame was a lowboy load. It was the biggest thing I ever saw at that time.
Yeah, thanks. And disclosure here, I was the project manager section 4 where Mr. Click was present at the same time as an operator, and his dad was actually there at the same time. Tells you how old I've become in this process. But he's absolutely correct. That was a percussion type drill, and it was required because we would on the installation of each of these VSMs, you have to drill the hole first to put the pipe in the ground, the actual VSM itself. And there's 77,000 of those along the pipeline route. So it's a massive undertaking to do the drilling for all the VSMs and then do the installation of the above ground hardware.
want to thank you guys for all the information. I was thinking about the impact on Fairbanks, the social impact, and how it was very interesting to be in town and to see all these people who enrolled at UAF just so they would have a place to sleep. It was truly amazing. And when Scott put together his little graphic about the amount of money floating around, I wonder if he included the people who were here very temporarily. And the reason I say that is I was on a flight from Seattle to Fairbanks, and I sat next to this lady who was on the route. And she spent time in Chicago, in Las Vegas, and Fairbanks. And that was her route. And I don't know if he factored that into the wealth and the income of what was happening in this town. But one last question. I really enjoyed Dave's book, and I wonder if he could talk a little bit about the whole management of these different sections. That to me was what was so impressive.
Yeah, because there's one incident that is in the book that isn't really common knowledge, but initially, like I mentioned, with the 5 sections, then we had Bechtel was brought on board to control each of the 5 execution contractors, and then finally Bechtel reported Alyeska. Well, we got on the project, and about halfway through in 1975, Bechtel was insistent upon an organizational structure that all the key decision-making had to occur in Fairbanks, even when the activity was going on in each of the 5 sections. And it got to be too cumbersome. And Alyeska and myself and others in the field started to get nervous about this slowing down of the pace of the construction, waiting for direction to come from Fairbanks down to each one of the sections. So Bechtel was warned repeatedly that you have to change this organizational structure to accommodate how the speed of this project is progressing forward, and you're not keeping up on it. And they were warned once, twice. The third time around, we terminated Bechtel halfway through the project, and Alyeska itself took over the actual management of the execution contractors. And that was a really severe blow to Bechtel. They had never had that happen on a major project like this, but it was required because the one thing we had to do that was a certainty is complete the project and get it operational in June of 1977. And the primary reason for that being that schedule driven was it was $8 billion of expenditure to complete the pipeline. But people forget that at Prudhoe Bay, there was equal amounts of money, 8 billion plus up there for all the field development activities, all the drilling of the wells, 150 wells that had to be drilled. You put it all together, $15-16 billion project in 1977 terms, which in today's money, this was a bet of $35 billion without any return of capital until the oil starts to flow. And that's why it was a schedule-driven project. And we all knew that. They were part of it.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of reiterate that. Somebody had a question there about, or observation about the social impact of pipeline construction days on Fairbanks and other communities. It's true, and there was impact funds spent to mitigate that to somewhat. But the slide that Scott had about the $330 billion of revenue, that's revenue that came from oil going through the meter. So all this construction impact and people, flying in and flying out had really nothing. The money started flowing in 1978, and since everything prior to that started back to buying a pipe was no revenue for anybody, including the state of Alaska.
One last question for you guys. Dave, I really appreciate you talking about, it wasn't just the pipeline, it was also the oil fields. It was also the fleet of tankers, the largest civilian shipbuilding program in American history. 50 new built tankers just for TAPS. And when you add all that up, it's another few billion on top. And I'd highly recommend, there's a great book called Little Did We Know, Financing the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System by John Miller, who eventually was CEO of Sohio. towards the end of his career. Phenomenal book that talks about, so Ohio almost went bankrupt, financing this project. It was a really big deal. But Senator Bishop's comment about the machinery made me think about all of the machines that were required to make this happen. And Miller in his book talks about how it actually depressed the entire American market for heavy machinery for years to come. But then, you hear these stories about, well, we were done with construction and we just needed to get rid of some of these machines. So you hear stories about, well, maybe we just pushed the cat in the hole and it got covered up. I didn't know if you guys, what happened to a bunch of that machinery? Was some of it just buried along the route? I mean, you hear these stories. I don't know if there's any truth to it.
Well, there's the decommissioning of the demobilization was a big deal. And it's kind of like the Panama Canal when I can't remember which way it went. Was it all the equipment for the Alaska Railroad shipped to the Panama Canal? Same thing with there. So all this cat, Caterpillar, you couldn't find a cat anywhere in the United States if we had them all. And so after construction, they all got put on trains and ships and went to Moses Lake, Washington, right? And I don't know what's there. Anybody been there? There's nothing there, but that's where they all went for auction.
Yeah, it's true. The equipment was auctioned off, and some of the heavier iron ended up over in Saudi Arabia on projects over there. But keep in mind, though, that about half the equipment that came for the project was actually supplied by the execution contractors. So that equipment originated down in the lower 48 states off of some other projects, and after the Alyeska project was over, that was returned back to those construction contractors. They took it back down to their own spreads down there, with the exception of the big drilling equipment, like the specialty equipment that actually Alyeska bought a fair amount of the actual heavy duty iron for the project. The rest was all, and that was also auctioned off at the conclusion of the project.
Okay, fascinating conversation. Let's thank all four of our panelists.